I'd like to welcome you to Tools for More Effective Board Meetings and Decision Making. This webinar is part of the Dennis C. Miller Full 2020 webinar series. I would like to introduce our speakers today. We have, oh yes, a few helpful notes. There is going to be time for question and answer at the end of the program. If you'd like to submit a question, you can send it via the chat function on the Zoom screen. You can send it publicly so that everyone sees your question. If you'd like to send it anonymously, feel free to address it to Dennis Miller. I will pick your questions up from there. And again, we will circulate a recording of the webinar to participants in another day or two. Our speakers today are Gregory Nielsen and Bill Neigher. Gregory is Senior Vice President of Dennis Miller Associates and is also President and CEO of Nielsen Training and Consulting. He is an experienced nonprofit CEO and is passionate about helping leaders and organizations excel. Gregory previously served as CEO of the Center for Nonprofit Excellence, and when he was there, he expanded the reach of the organization to serve more than 500 nonprofit organizations through consulting and professional development. During this time, he also launched Destination Excellence, a 6-month leadership development program for nonprofit executives, and Circles of Excellence, a peer-to-peer learning program for nonprofit leaders. Gregory is a military veteran, and he has previously served as an officer and attorney in the United States Army Judge Advocate General's Corps. In 2016, Gregory was named a 40 under 40 honoree by the Louisville Business First publication. Bill Neigher is Senior Vice President of Dennis C. Miller Associates and CEO and principal of the Vantagepoint Group, a national consulting practice that supports the vision, strategy, and results for nonprofit organizations, business, and industry. Bill is a community psychologist specializing in strategic planning, program development, and evaluation research, and he is an elected fellow of the American Psychological Association. Bill has worked in these areas with the United Nations, the US Senate, Harvard, the National Institute of Mental Health, the World Health Organization, Hoffman LaRoche Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, and Verizon's National Healthcare Customer Advisory Board. He also has served as Vice President for System Development and Chief Strategy Officer for the Atlantic Health System in New Jersey. Bill's publications include more than 50 books, chapters, and scientific journal articles, and in 2010, he received the Distinguished Contribution to Practice in Community Psychology Award from the American Psychological Association's Division of Community Psychology. So gentlemen, I turn things over to you, and thanks for being with us today.
And thank you everyone for joining us. So I have some good news and some really good news. The good news is that neither Greg or I are going to read our slides to you. You will, as Michelle said, have access to those going forward. And the second bit of good news is that we're each going to talk about 20 minutes. I'll split my presentation up. Dennis has the heart in the center, and we'll have 20 minutes or more for you to direct us. Through the chat room, as Michelle said, you'll guide us into either clarifying what we've said or to move us in a different direction that you want us to comment on. So the first slide is no surprise to any of you. You didn't have to join this webinar to find out. It is an extremely challenging time for nonprofits, and it was so before the pandemic. So just to speak to the first one, in working with boards of trustees and not-for-profits over the last 12 months, the single most prominent feedback that I get, and probably Greg, the same for you, is what's job one? Ensuring a sustainable financial future for our organization. And it is very, very challenging. We're all looking at the same funding sources. We're all looking at how what we need to do to steward our organizations to move forward. So while you're listening to an attorney and a psychologist tell you about meetings, well, so in my nearly 4 decades, 31 of which are in faith-based, not-for-profit healthcare, I probably have spent most of my adult life leading, running, going to, sitting in meetings. I asked Siri, well, how much of my adult life have I spent doing that? And she simply responded, you really don't want to know. So number 12 out of the 11 to make an even dozen is how to run a successful virtual meeting. Greg, thank you. Next slide, please. So you can order this on Amazon. If you look at it once a day, you will save yourself $10,000 worth of psychotherapy and also add 10 years to your life. But the slide is here because time really is not on our side. We are all looking to see how to do more with less. We have all looked at the same strategic partnerships. And one of the challenges that we have doing virtual meetings comes from my colleagues in cognitive psychology. And this, you can put your guess into the chat room. What do you think is the maximum adult attention span that we all have for virtual meetings? So you get a chance to win a free drawing. Tell me what you think it is, put it in the chat room, and I'll tell you what it is. Greg, next, please. So there is a bumper sticker that says, make new mistakes. And the mistake that I have made the most of during my career is what you see on the screen. It's about culture. If the culture of mutual accountability doesn't exist in our organizations, we can strategize all we want. It's going to be extremely challenging to do. And one of the challenges most prevalent right now, particularly in the virtual world, is that of mutual accountability. If we don't do the pre-work, if people don't come prepared, just like in an in-person meeting, if the follow-up isn't good, if I know that I can just come to a meeting and not really participate or do everything that we need to do, that culture will be prevalent and it will trump everything else that we really try to do. So being present in the moment is really critical. And that's hard to do when your audience hasn't joined in, either by sharing themselves on video. If they're not, they're just dialing in. You know who you are. You're either on Amazon or you're on Gmail, and you're doing something else other than being present in the moment. So Greg, if you would advance, please, one more. Running virtual meetings is extremely difficult to do, even for the best of organizations. What can possibly go wrong? So the next, Greg, please. If you look at just the red highlights, I want to talk to just a couple of these to go forward. So the most important thing to talk about is something called the 20-20-20 rule. I'll give you one more of these. So every 20 minutes, you need to take your eyes off the screen and look 20 feet away for 20 seconds. This is one of the things that we learned from the good ergonomic folks in corporate health in the hospital system. One of the challenges in particularly the virtual meetings is to be able to stay present and stay focused. People are easily distracted. So the very first bullet point is be present here for however long this is going to take place. And then the last part is the question about concentration. We'll come back to that once again. So next slide, please. So there is another rule that has to do with numbers, and it's a 20-60-20 rule. And that is pretty much an evidence-based look at what happens in organizations during times of rapid organizational change. So 20% of the folks we know from all of the literature are going to fight the change to the death. Whatever you do, however you try to move them, they're not there. 20% get it immediately. If the change has to come back, if I have to change my role, if I have to accommodate a different set of directions, I'll do it. But the 60% is, do I really need to choose yet? Don't pick sides. Don't sign up for or against. Let me just kind of ride the tide and see what happens as we go along. So the important thing really to make the transition is, how do we set priorities, particularly during these meetings, particularly for our organizations? And giving it back to Greg, this is where he's going to pick up the conversation.
Thank you, Bill. I appreciate that. And also want to echo Bill's earlier comments, welcoming everybody to the webinar today. Also want to encourage you, as Bill mentioned, we specifically designed this webinar to leave plenty of time at the end of the webinar for questions and discussion, because we know that the needs of every organization, every leader are slightly different when it comes to virtual meetings. We're all trying to navigate this from a different perspective. And so where I want to pick up from Bill is a sense of how do we structure our meeting agendas, whether it's in an in-person environment or whether it's in a virtual environment. I think we've all been part of the meetings where we have what I call the copy and paste agenda. We've seen it. I've seen it plenty of times as a nonprofit executive, as a board member. We've seen the meeting that starts with ratification of minutes. It then moves to the CEO report. It then moves to the committee report, old business, new business, adjourn, copy, paste for the next month. What happens is we have lulled our organizations, we have lulled our board members to sleep. Instead, I encourage you to think of your meetings as a dynamic opportunity to engage with your board members, to engage with senior staff and those present, to show them that their time is valuable. Their time is valued, and we are going to make use of their skills, their talents, and their expertise throughout the course of the meeting. So when I work with nonprofit organizations, I tell them, let's see if we can revamp the board meeting agenda and let's design it along 4 principles, right? Every board meeting agenda, we want to take some time at the outset of the meeting to celebrate progress. Now, notice I said celebrate progress. I didn't say celebrate success. We don't have to have cured cancer since our last meeting. We don't have to have achieved a monumental accomplishment since our last meeting. But something has happened in our organizations, in every one of your organizations, that is worthy of celebration since the board last got together. Let's highlight that. Let's celebrate that. Let's get the board feeling good about themselves, feeling good about the direction of the organization. That's agenda item 1. Agenda item 2 is where we see the need for partnership between board leadership and the executive director. So the second point we want to see in board meeting agendas is discussion of challenges. When we script an agenda to have a CEO report or an executive director report, as it were, what happens? We typically have 10 to 15 minutes. And as a former executive director, I am guilty of this myself. What happens is, as an executive, I want to fill that time. And so I'm going to download every single thing that's in my head to the board. And the board members are swimming. And what happens is the board members become passive. Right? There is no entry point. There is no on-ramp for board engagement there. Instead, I feel good because I've told the board all of my worries, all of my concerns. Instead, if what we want is an engaged board, what we need to do is think in advance. As an executive, as a board chair, as officers, what are the 2, 3, or 4 at most key challenges that we need the board to know about in this meeting? If we had to boil it down, if we had to distill it to 2, 3, or no more than 4 challenges, what do we want those to be? Those are the key takeaways that we want board members to have in their head. And then step 3 on that agenda is let's brainstorm solutions together. And this is where we're inviting engagement from the board. We're not saying here is everything that has happened in the organization over the last month. Instead, we're saying here are the 2 or 3 most critical items that require your expertise as board members. And now we're inviting your engagement. Let's brainstorm ways to address those challenges together as a team. That's a step towards becoming a team and towards a step towards inviting engagement among the board. So we're not having virtual meetings where I, as the executive director, am doing all of the talking, or the board chair is doing all of the talking. Instead, we're spreading that around. We're getting everybody involved, and that's keeping people engaged and keeping people involved. And then finally, and some would argue most importantly, is before we wrap up the meeting, we are going to take time to identify and commit to next steps. Put simply, who is going to do what by when? So if Bill, as my board member, commits to following up with one of the contacts in his network by January 1st, we're going to document that in the minutes so that when I go back and I have a conversation with Bill on January 2nd and I say, Bill, do you remember that board meeting? Do you remember when you said you were going to reach out to Dennis Miller in your network? I have something to refer back to. Right? We have an identification and a commitment to next steps. Now, when we think about a virtual board meeting, how many of us have been part of webinars, have been part of meetings that start with some version of, are you there? Can you hear me? Can you see my slides? Right? There is nothing more disengaging for board members at the outset than a sense that things are not working smoothly, or a sense that those who are facilitating the meeting are not necessarily prepared for the virtual environment. So when we think about virtual board meetings, the word I come back to over and over again is preparation. How much preparation have you done? How much testing of the technology have you done? How ready are you for things that will go well and the inevitable things that will pop up and will need to be addressed on the fly? It's important to realize when we're talking about virtual meetings that by nature, we're not together. We're not in the same room. So you see on this slide a pyramid of meeting engagement. At the very bottom of the pyramid, meaning it is the least engaging way that we can interact with one another, is things like chat, things like screen share, things like polls. I, as an executive, or I, as a board officer, can't read your body language if all we're doing is chatting back and forth with one another. The next step up is audio. So when Bill mentioned at the outset of the webinar, how many people are going to show their faces in a meeting? How many people will turn on video in a meeting? The reason is because when I can see your face and I can read your body language, it is much easier to get engagement. It's much easier to understand who is engaged in this meeting right now. What are some of the concerns I need to look for? What are some of the key body language symbols I may be getting, signals that I may be getting? The next step up, as Bill mentioned, is video, telepresence, and then finally at the top of the pyramid, what I'm sure we all would love to be doing right now is more face-to-face meetings. You know, after 6 months, 7 months, 8 months of being confined to Zoom for our board meetings, for our staff meetings, I know a lot of nonprofit leaders that are craving the time when we can go back to being together face-to-face with our board members, with our staff members. So again, thinking through how am I going to drive engagement depending on the limitations of the meeting? So if all we can have is audio, I'm going to need to work a lot harder as a nonprofit leader to build that engagement, right? If we can get video, that's a step forward. It's still not as good as face-to-face, but it's a step forward. So as you think through your own meetings, think through what requirements, what expectations will you have of those who are participating in the meeting. When we think about a virtual board meeting, one of the takeaways I want you to have is as you approach that meeting, be crystal clear in your own mind and with your team. What is the why? What is the how? And what is the what of this meeting? If you can break the meeting into those three components and use that as a takeaway, that's a great framework to begin. And let's talk through what I mean by each one of those. When I think of the why, think about why is this group getting together? So before you approach your board meeting, before you approach your staff meeting, think about what is our why for this specific meeting? Is it a regular board meeting, meaning it's our monthly opportunity to come together as a board? Is it our annual meeting where we have some specific business to attend to? Is it an election? Or is it an emergency meeting? Has something come up or something happened in the organization that necessitates that we get together? Knowing the why of the meeting is going to determine how you structure the agenda, how you drive engagement, how you build commitment throughout. Think through also the limitations of the virtual meeting. The first place to start when you think about limitations of a virtual meeting is your bylaws. Are there anything in your nonprofit organization's bylaws that limit your ability to have a virtual meeting? Are there any types of business that your organization can't transact in the virtual environment? Do you need to make exceptions or emergency changes to your bylaws to account for the situation that we find ourselves in right now? Second point, check your state laws. Many states have what are called sunshine laws, which mandate types of business that have to be transacted in person, types of business that meetings that have to be open to the public in some way. So if you are a larger organization, if you have state contracts, make sure that you're checking your state laws for any limitations on virtual business. And then third limitation is governance practice. So all of those best practices that you have when your board is together in person, how can you transfer those? How can you transition those into the virtual environment so that you don't lose those best practices? Second, when I talk to boards about virtual meetings, is it's important to develop the rules of the road together. Meaning, as the executive director, I'm not going to dictate what the norms of our team are going to be in the virtual environment to the board. So the board is not going to show up one day and see a list of 10 expectations. Instead, it's far more effective to create buy-in among the board. Have a 10 to 15-minute conversation in your next virtual board meeting that says, you know what, we're likely to be virtual for a while. Let's discuss and let's decide on the norms that we're willing to abide by together as a team. I'll give you a couple of examples. For example, we're going to mute ourselves when we don't speak. We're going to all agree to show video together. We're going to agree to take a 5 to 10-minute break every hour that we're together for a meeting, right? So different norms, different rules of the road. It's important to create those rules of the road together. It generates buy-in for the team. Next is, I'm often asked the question, okay, Greg, what platform do we use for our virtual meetings? I know there is this platform Zoom, and I've heard about Teams and WebEx and all of these different platforms that are out there. Which is the magical platform that is right for us? The simple answer is the platform that is right for you is the one that the greatest number of your team members are or can be comfortable with. There are phenomenal features on all of the platforms that you see on the screen and all of the platforms that are not listed on the screen. The issue is, where as a team do you have the greatest level of comfort? If I personally, as the executive director, am most comfortable on Zoom, but 90% of my board prefers Microsoft Teams because that's what they use in their daily life, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to flex my needs to the needs of the board team, right? Because that's where people have the greatest degree of comfort. And we know that people are going to be most engaged when they are most comfortable with the platform being used. Test the technology, meaning as an executive director, as a board leader, I know that there is nothing that is going to kill the energy of my board meeting faster than if we have to waste the first 10 to 15 minutes of our board meeting because 3 of our board members either can't get on the platform or can't figure out how to mute or unmute themselves or can't figure out how to show their video. So what am I going to do as a board leader, as an executive director? I'm going to make sure that I spend a few minutes with each board member individually in advance of the first virtual meeting that we have, testing the technology. I want to make sure, Bill, Dennis, Michelle, are each of you comfortable with the platform we're using, the features that are going to be most important to us during the course of the meeting itself, and make sure that we test those together so that when the meeting time and when the meeting date rolls around, we are ready to roll. We are ready to kick it into high gear, and we're not losing time with trying to figure out the lay of the land and the landscape and the features involved. I'm also going to plan the agenda even more thoughtfully in a virtual environment than I do in person. So you know from my previous slide when I talked about meeting priorities, and I'm a big proponent of planning a thoughtful meeting agenda and having priorities involved. The virtual meeting makes that even more essential. My encouragement to you is limit or streamline your board meeting agendas in the virtual environment. If you were able to cover 7 things when you were face to face, consider cutting that down to 5 items in the virtual meeting. It's going to take more time to cover those items than it did when you were face to face. It's just the nature of the technology. Also consider assigning roles. So another way to drive engagement in any virtual meeting that you're part of is to give people a job. Someone may be the facilitator of the meeting. Let's keep us on track. Let's keep our time consistent. Let's make sure that we're facilitating the discussion effectively. Someone else may be the secretary who's taking minutes, who's taking notes from the meeting. Someone else may be the chat monitor. So if there are any questions that come up or any things that we want to address as a team that are posted in chat, we have someone monitoring that. And then finally, someone who is involved in tech support, meaning if Bill or Michelle or anyone else is having trouble from a technology standpoint, they know who to direct their questions to. The other benefit of the virtual environment is you can rotate these roles. So Greg doesn't get stuck being the chat monitor in every meeting. The next meeting, we may rotate that to a different board member. What it does is it gives everybody a job. It gives everybody a sense of ownership in the success of that meeting. Begin your meetings intentionally. I told you nothing kills the energy of a meeting at the beginning more than individuals who are having trouble with technical support. We also know from the literature, and I'm sure Bill will back me up on this from a psychological standpoint, energy level is never higher. Focus is never greater than it is at the outset of the meeting. So if you want to grab your board, if you want to grasp their attention, do so with something strong at the outset of the meeting. Even if you have to script your opening line or your opening sentence of the meeting, think about how you are intentionally going to begin that meeting strong. Think about a check-in. As a board team, how are we holding up? How are we supporting one another? Is there anything that we need to be aware of as a team as we start this meeting? Identify clearly for the board at the outset, what is the purpose of this meeting? We are together because this is our regular monthly meeting, or we are together because tonight is our budget meeting where we're going to be presenting the budget and we're going to be asking you as a board to discuss and approve the fiscal year budget, right? What is the crystal clear reason that we're getting together today? And then finally, preview for the board, what actions am I going to ask you to take? What decisions are we asking you to make as part of this meeting? As a board member, yes, I should read the materials in advance. I should be familiar with the agenda and the reports, but it doesn't hurt at the beginning of the meeting to give me a preview as a board member. What are you going to be asking me to do? What decisions are you going to be asking us as a team to make so that I'm in the mindset, I'm going to be listening and attuned for the signals and the data and the information I need to make an effective decision? When you think of the virtual meeting and the how, minimize your level of presentation, maximize discussion. What we all know, having participated in countless Zoom meetings over the last 6 to 7 months, is we are more engaged when we know that someone may be asking us a question, when we know that someone is going to be asking for our feedback, insights, and input. Keep that in mind when you think about your virtual board meeting. It is very easy for board members to pick up their phone, as Bill mentioned, to be scanning Amazon. How is my package delivery going for Christmas gifts on Amazon, right? It's easy to be distracted right now in a virtual environment. It is far less so if we're engaged, if we're part of the discussion, and also monitor the energy level. One of the benefits of being able to see the participants in your virtual meeting is you can monitor the energy level. You can see if I start to recline back or if I start to look disengaged, maybe that's a time for a break. Or maybe that's a time for a group activity. Maybe that's a time to just shake things up a little bit. But the benefit of being able to see your team members is the ability to monitor that energy level. The other recommendation I have in terms of the how of virtual meetings is make sure you're capturing feedback in real time. So one of the challenges when it comes to virtual meetings and when I can't necessarily see and read your body language is I want to know as an executive director, as a board leader, is this meeting effective for you? Do you feel as though this has been an effective use of your time? Right? So one of the things you may want to consider is at the end of every meeting, taking 5 minutes in the agenda to capture feedback in real time. I want to have a 5-minute discussion with you as a board. What was the best part of this meeting? What was the part of this meeting you felt most energized and engaged? What was the part of the meeting in which you felt the least engaged? Capture that in real time because it enables your next meeting to be even better than the one before, right? Finally, engage the elephants in the room. One of the temptations we all have as nonprofit leaders, guilty as charged myself over and over again, is it is very easy in a virtual meeting to ignore the elephants in the room, right? I may see something or detect something or pick up something in Bill's body language that tells me, uh-oh, he's not on board with this. He has some real questions, some real concerns. In a virtual environment where Bill may be muted while I'm making a presentation, it is incredibly easy for me to plow right on through that and get to the next agenda item. What happens though is I've now given a minor concern an opportunity to over time mushroom into something that could derail our board and build dysfunction into the team. Instead, my encouragement to you is engage the elephants in the room. If you see something that is causing you concern, if you think that a board member has a question, pause. That's a time to say, Bill, it looks like you're not completely on board here? Or Bill, do I see that you have a question? Is there something that would benefit you if we just paused here and addressed something? Engage the elephants in the room. And as I said, make sure you secure and record commitments to action. Bill, I'm going to turn it back over to you now.
Great. Greg, could you go back one slide? Just go
I
back to
sure
your
can.
last one. It's great content, and I've got good notes from it. So let me drift off script for about 60 seconds and respond to some of the points that Greg made. So I'm a survivor of quality counsel from 2 to 5 p.m. on Friday afternoons. You know what? As one of my colleagues described it, the meeting from hell. How many of you have been in that meeting? The second thing is just shoot me now. This has gone on way, way too long. And we used a quote from my colleague, Dr. John Califat, in the promo for the meeting. John had come back from a meeting at one of the hospital sites, and he looked like he'd been run over by a bus. Said, John, how was the meeting? And he said, 20 minutes of content crammed into 2 hours. So Greg's point is exactly on point. From the literature, how long does it take people to form an impression of the speaker? You might be surprised as I was, 7 to 15 seconds. So Greg's earlier point is what you say first matters. You really have to grab and retain attention. From a long time in doing post-meeting evaluations, board meetings, the single most prevalent feedback that you get is, you did not respect my time. And that is one of the things that is the most difficult to do. As Greg said all the way through the presentation, prioritize, look at content, keep it moving, look at the energy level to be able to move it. And lastly, before we go on, is something you may have heard of called the ABCs of the meeting, an absolute behavioral contract. And it goes back to how I began, which is a culture of mutual accountability. And it has to start at day one and it has to continue. What is an ABC? I come prepared. I will have done my homework. I will actively participate visually and being present in the moment. And finally, on follow-up, the transition that we really all need to take to is, how long is this going to last? Will by August of 21, we be back to business as usual? But for many professions, including my own, looking at the virtual world will be something that will be here to stay, and virtual meetings will continue to challenge us. Greg, if you would, please. So I want to hit 3 of these discussion points very, very quickly. The first, which is pointed out, is if you can send it in an email, it doesn't need to take up time in a meeting. 45 PowerPoint slides are 43 too many. We really need to look at content and how we evaluate those. The second bullet point here, review mission, vision, and value statement every time at every meeting. And why? Yeah, we've seen that. That's a nice thing to do. It's really critical. And I'm going to illustrate that on the next slide, in which we need to do. I'm sorry, Greg. Go back one more point from this last slide. And it's the very last point. Greg has the actual picture of the elephant. Mine is simply the last bullet point on this slide. Not all the elephants are in the room. So if there is a difference, and we know it from the literature, between, yeah, I'll go along with this, we're doing the multi-voting, we're looking at how we need to do to move off this agenda item. Not I'll go along, but do you truly have people who are willing to support it? Because if you don't, you'll have that false narrative. You will not be able to recover easily from it. Thank you, Greg. Now to the next one. Many of you are probably familiar with the toolkit that came from the Total Quality Improvement mode. This is Crosby and Deming and Duran. This is after the Second World War. And this was an attempt to look at quality issues in American industry largely. Wasn't much interest here. They took it to Japan for post-war reconstruction. Japanese really adopted this as a culture. And the quality movement really took hold, to such extent that, you may know, the Triniton picture tube that really opened the way for color television was invented by GE. You know, we didn't know what to do with it, so we sold it to Sony. What did Sony do with the patent? Well, they killed the American television industry with it. When's the last time you saw an ad for a TV made in this country? The CQI toolkit, if you don't know it, is easy to learn, to develop, and there are great meeting tools that you can do with it, either in breakout rooms, particularly before the meeting comes into place, and then what you can do to rapidly form consensus. I'm going to give you in the next to the last slide a link to being able to find the toolkit. You should learn them. You may already have used them years ago, but they really, really are extraordinarily helpful to be able to do it. I'm going to give you one example in a minute, but I just want to give you an example, again, from one of Greg's slides having to do with follow through. And it's why it's so important to review mission, vision, values. In doing the prep for a board retreat for a North American organization, 75-year, very proud history in social justice, going back to involvement with Martin Luther King. Their mission statement had 10 different elements. They were doing everything. And they were also now struggling with the realities of fewer donors, fewer members, and looking at that single question: how do we as board members ensure a sustainable financial future? So what I did in my prep is I went back to that mission, vision, values. And I asked the CFO to do one single graph for me, which is, of the 10 attributes of mission, what are you spending your time doing? The second is, what percent of effort are you doing with it, and what percent of the budget? Took about 20 minutes. What did the slide show? Well, of the 10 mission attributes that they had, they were spending 65% of their time on just 2. The other part was it was getting 15% of the budget. If it was that important, what was happening to the other 85%? The board chair's reaction was, you can't show this at the board retreat. I said, why? Because the trustees will all freak out. But more important, by avoiding that term mission creep, you've heard that before. It is so easy to extend, to move off mission, and ask yourself the question, what are truly the pathways to the vision? How do we stay focused and move those forward? So Greg, if you would, I'm going to give you one example in the next slide. This is one of the 7 CQI tools. You probably have seen it before or used it. It's called a fishbone diagram, or cause and effect, Ishikawa, if you're truly aficionados. And a lot of my work has been in evaluating strategy. There are really 3 buckets I found for strategy failures. The first, the right strategy, we couldn't execute it. The second bucket, the right strategy, we wouldn't execute it. We could have, but we chose to let all of the organizational resistance undercut it. The third is my favorite, the wrong strategy, perfectly executed. This tool is a way to avoid that. So it's relatively simple. It can be done in a breakout room. It can be done in 4. You look at the far right, defects per 1,000 occurrences. This is an industrial one. It basically says, well, what's causing the defects? And then you can see in blue around on the fishbone, it's how we measure, it's what our environments are. And then from there, it's easily to drop off what are the contributors. If you take the time to use the 7 CQI tools, particularly cause and effect, you can quickly get down to what is really the source of our concern as we move forward. Greg, if you would go to the next slide. And we are almost exactly to our 40 minutes. We're at 39 and change. When Greg and I were talking about what to leave you with after this webinar. The first are a series of online meeting resources. They're all very current. So from the Harvard Business Review in March, from Slack, from Ford's, the New York Times, if you look at these links, you will find 2 things. You will find lessons learned from looking at the evaluation of virtual meetings, its content and agenda, but you'll also be able to see some templates and some rules of the road. They're really all good. You can curate them, look at what might be best for your organization. And the last one, the Community Toolbox. This is one of the resources from my division of the American Psychological Association, Community Psychology. It is 46 content chapters, 8,000 landing pages, open source from all over the world. Open source meaning that anybody can improve them. And in these 46 chapters, you will be able to see the one that I have here is on leadership, group facilitation. You can download templates, PowerPoint slides that you can put your logo on. And it has to do with everything from writing and competing for grants, leadership and management, community needs assessment. It's a really great resource. It's all free. Steal everything that you need to do and make it your own. So there are a series of resources. And before Greg goes to the very last one, this has been a challenge for us to do. So many lessons learned. What we had hoped to accomplish is hit some of the highlights, hit some of the failures that I think both of us have. And Greg said that earlier. We knew better, but we did it anyway. We didn't create that culture of mutual accountability. And when we did those meeting feedbacks, it was, you didn't really respect our time. This wasn't the agenda we needed to do. So we're going to give Margaret Mead the last word here. And for all of us working in the world of nonprofits, N equals 1. Thank you, Margaret. Michelle, back to you, and we'll try to respond to the questions that people have put in the chat. And I'll try to give all the annoying ones to Greg.
Thank you both. This was terrific. And before we get to questions, I do want to mention to folks that the Dennis Miller Fall 2020 season has one more webinar. It is called Keys to Successful Leadership Recruitment, the 5 key stages of the executive search process. When I send around the recording of this, I'll include a registration link. If you're interested, we'd love to have you. There is one question, the first question that came in is asking about brainstorming time. And the question is, should brainstorming sessions be limited to a certain number of minutes so that the board doesn't get caught up in that to the exclusion of other things? And then the thought is, after that time, should ideas go to subcommittee for follow-up? Your thoughts?
I'll jump in first, Bill, and then you can add thoughts as well. I think that's a great observation, and I think that is spot on. I'm a big proponent of giving the board parameters for the discussion, and one of those parameters is time, meaning we're going to take the next 10 to 15 minutes, whatever that time frame is, and that's going to be our time to brainstorm. So I think that's one important parameter for the board. The second is thinking intentionally about the questions that you're asking for the board. So the question is not a broad, so how do we make this better? Right? That invites board members to get down in the weeds. Instead, if you've thought about the challenge in advance of the meeting, you can structure the question in such a way that it invites the right type of board engagement. It invites and gives the board a framework of, this is where I'm being asked to provide my feedback, provide my insights. So I think sometimes the framing of the question is important, the timing is important, and then the follow-up. Maybe it's a committee, maybe it's a subcommittee, maybe it's we're going to table this conversation and take it up at the next meeting after we've enacted some of this guidance or after we've tried some of these things. Bill, anything you'd want to add?
A brief coda so we can get as many questions and comments in as we can. So brainstorming is one of the 7 fundamental CQI tools. The thing that's hard for people to understand is brainstorming is about quantity, not quality. Don't censor, don't suppress somebody else's negative contributions to it. And then out of the that brainstorming tool comes another CQI tool called an affinity diagram, which is, you've got all this stuff, you've got Post-it notes all over the place if you've ever been through them. Now, really, what are the key takeaways for those to do that as well? The answer to the question that I raised earlier, how much is too long? Human attention span starts to wane at 45 minutes. 45 minutes. So that's why I talked about my 3-hour quality council. So you can imagine if you're going to try to do a 20-minute brainstorming exercise in a chat room, my advice, take it offline, do it advanced. Now what you can do is you can report the results, and now there's a chance to build consensus and to move it forward.
Okay, you ready for the next question?
We are.
How do you balance the need for learning versus doing? Oftentimes, boards need more training on the functionality of nonprofits so they can provide feedback and guidance. What's the appropriate ratio?
Bill, why don't you take this one first?
Thanks a lot. One size doesn't fit all. We've seen and been involved, both Greg and I, in board retreats where you have 3 different groups. You have a group of either leadership, or you have a group of board members who are really just coming on. This is, like year 1. You have others who are legacy people. They've been with the organization for many years. I think my learned experience is you can do leadership development, OD, organizational development, offline. You can try to even have a set of tools that people can use and make them available so you don't have to do it all together. Well, you can look at the slide set, get your question and do it as far as you can. It's a good question. It's difficult. The board participation, leadership development for senior and middle management, I think it all depends on the organization that you have and ultimately where you're trying to move your board towards achieving those pathways to the vision. Greg?
Yeah, I'll add to that, Bill, and I echo what you said. Having been part of a number of board retreats and facilitating those, my encouragement is to think of board development. So to think of the growth of your board in the same way you think of the growth of your staff, right? When we think about developing our staff, we think about it from a coaching mindset, meaning it's something we do throughout the year. It's not just a once a year class or a once a year course that we send our staff members to. It's something that we're trying to develop individuals throughout the year. It's the same way with our boards. So rather than thinking of developing your board and growing their understanding of nonprofit governance as a once a year training or a once a year board retreat, my encouragement is to put an element of board development into each board meeting agenda. Right? Even if it's only 5 minutes, even if it's an article that you share in advance of the meeting, keeping that development and that learning mindset creates a culture of learning or a culture of development among the board. And so it's not something that's jarring once a year. And so I don't know that there's an appropriate ratio so much as a slow and steady continuous build of the board's understanding and the board's knowledge of governance. It's not a destination. It's more about the journey that the team is on together.
Okay,
Great question.
Here's another question. That's kind of along the same lines. Someone's saying that their agendas tend to be heavy on, every committee gets to make a report. And so by the time you get to the end of all the reports, everyone's we've hit our 45-minute limit, we're exhausted. But there's also a desire to give everyone an opportunity to talk about, what they've been working on and the hard work that they've been putting in. So how would you suggest balancing that for more productivity at board meetings?
So I'm going to hop in this one first. I have 3 suggestions. First of all, don't do it. You don't do these updates. This is work that's done in advance. What you want the committees to do is say, where am I stuck? Send it out in advance. So here's the minutes, here's the committee meeting, here are our action steps, but here is where we need the help of the organization. Focus your time on looking at that. It's problem identification and problem solving.
I would echo exactly what Bill said. I would also encourage you, if you're not already doing so, to consider the use of a consent agenda. So if you're not familiar with a consent agenda involves your committees send out their reports in writing to the board in advance of the meeting. The board has a common understanding and an expectation that board members will read those reports in advance of the meeting. And then when it comes time for the committee on the agenda, instead of reading a report, instead of delivering a report and presenting to the board, as Bill said, it's an opportunity for discussion and engagement. So rather than taking 5 to 10 minutes per committee to report on everything they've done, it's an asking for questions. So was there anything from our committee's work that concerned you as a board or generated questions? And or, as Bill said, where are we stuck? So as a committee, we are wrestling with this question. It would benefit us to take 2 to 3 minutes to gather some input and insight and wisdom from the board as a whole. Again, the purpose of the meeting being to drive engagement rather than to download information. So again, thinking through how do we structure that agenda? How do we do so in a way that drives engagement rather than simply passive information?
Just so, and the only thing I'll do is come back to the elephants. So Greg's real elephant in mind, the elephants always aren't visible in the room. So if a board subcommittee is able to put up the question, the really difficult question, which is, here's the decision we want to take, but we understand that 2/3 of the board going into this have reservations about. List them. That gives everybody a chance to think about those, and you have really the true opportunity to be disclosive and non-punitive and put everything on the table in the meeting.
The next question asks, what board evaluation methods have you used effectively?
I'll jump in, Bill. I do a ton of board evaluation, and so I have strong I have strong opinions on this one. When it comes to board evaluation, it's really critical to understand, what are you trying to evaluate? Are you trying to evaluate the board's performance? Are you trying to evaluate board members' individual performance? That's going to determine what evaluation method you use. So for some boards, if you're trying to look at the collective performance of the team, there are board self-assessments out there. I have one, a proprietary one that I like to use. There are others that are out there as well. Dennis has a fantastic board self-assessment tool also. That's for looking at, how is the board performing when it comes to fiscal management, when it comes to fundraising, marketing, being an ambassador in the community, kind of that holistic performance of the board. That has to be differentiated from, how are individual board members performing? So if I want board members to reflect on individually, where am I making the most impact? Where am I not making the most impact? Am I meeting the expectations that other board members have of me? That's a very different evaluation tool, right? That's much more of a personal self-reflection. And you can do that either with a facilitator, with the board leaders, or you can pair board members up for individual board reflection. But I think when you're talking about board evaluation, the first thing to do as a board is to be crystal clear of, what are we trying to evaluate, and then let the tool drive the goal rather than the other way around. So rather than selecting the tool and then making it fit what you hope to accomplish, identify clearly what you're trying to accomplish and then choose a tool that's likely to get you there. Bill?
A single learned example, do exactly what Greg just said. I paid $150,000 to the nice folks at the Harvard Balanced Scorecard, Norton and Kaplan, the world's best. Everybody hated it. It was a complete failure. But I paid $150,000 for a single sentence, and it came from Vice President Ann Nevius. And she said, you need to ensure that your board, every member of the organization, has line of sight understanding between my role as a leader, as a board member, the role of my group, whether it be the board, and the mission, vision, and values of the organization. Line of sight understanding. And the lesson that I've learned over and over again is how many barriers, how many mountains, how many misunderstandings stand in the way of doing that. So to go back to Greg's really great point, how do you now hardwire that understanding? The board as a whole functioning, we're just talking about boards for a minute, my committee, my subcommittee, what does the finance committee truly have to deliver in order for us to achieve the pathways to the vision 3 years from now? Not what I did last month, and not all of the donor designations that came in today, but taking that long strategic view of where we need to be.
Bill, just to piggyback off something you just said, I think the phrase that we don't use enough when we talk about board evaluation is buy-in. I have worked with a number of boards where either the board chair or the executive director wanted to do a board self-assessment, wanted to do some type of board evaluation. Yet when we talked to the board for the first time, that was the first they were hearing of it. And board evaluation wasn't something that they had collectively decided was needed for their team, but instead it was something that was being put upon them. Right? And that impacts their level of engagement, that impacts their level of participation, their level of willingness to be open to the evaluation and to give their genuine thoughts and feedback. So the first place I start when it comes to a conversation around board evaluation is why? Why are we doing this? And the second question is, how much ownership, how much engagement does the board have in this process? Have they chosen to do this as a team, or is this something that they have yet to hear about? Is this something that the leadership has decided for them? So again, thinking through that phrase buy-in and how you build that in advance of the assessment is also a critical factor in success.
In a last comment, you see what a good question it was. Normally we try to just to be brief, make the evaluation anonymous and make it binary. Make the board also look at what support they needed. from their fellow board members, from the other committees, from leadership. And if you do it both ways, now what you have is that chance of holding each other mutually accountable.
I actually am going to combine a question with a thought that occurs to me as I'm watching people pop off and saying they're on to the next Zoom meeting. We've probably all either heard about or experienced Zoom exhaustion at this point. So my first question is, what do you think is the future? I know we in one hand, we kind of envision us all running back to in-person meetings. Because we just really miss that interaction. But do you really see us fully giving up on the Zoom environment as, somewhat permanently? And the second part of that is we do a lot of, the PowerPoint screen share. What alternatives are you seeing to using the standard PowerPoint screen share? That was a lot of questions. So I'll back off now and let you get to those.
I will respond quickly, Michelle, and then I'm going to turn it over to my public health colleague, Bill, because I'm sure he has thoughts on this as well. From my perspective, I think that the virtual environment is here to stay in a hybrid format. So I always push back when I hear nonprofit leaders talk about when we get to the other side of this pandemic or when we are back in person, because I think for at least the foreseeable future, and when I say foreseeable future, I'm talking in terms of year or more. I'm not talking in terms of weeks or months. There are going to be board members, there are going to be staff members who are simply not comfortable in person, right? So I think the future is likely a hybrid of the virtual environment and in person. And so when we think about our facilitation and we think about our meetings, I don't think it's going to be an either or, meaning we are in person or we are on Zoom. I think it's likely to be, I have 5 board members who are in person and I have 5 board members who are on Zoom, and I need to be an effective and skilled facilitator to make sure that both groups are engaged and involved. Bill?
Exactly.
Bill agrees, apparently.
Apparently he does.
Well, we've got 2 minutes left, and I think if there's time for one more, maybe we could get in. But I think Greg is exactly right. I don't think it's ever going back to, we're going to have one physical board meeting, because there are advantages to being telepresent. We're able to get people in that one case where I did the North American board, who had people from Montreal who just couldn't come to the annual meeting. So I think that it's probably going to be the hybrid description, and we need to learn to avoid the Zoom fatigue. Don't do 2.5-hour meetings, make the content engaging, do the pre-work.
Michelle, if I could, because I know we only have 2 minutes left with folks, I
Yes.
really believe in making sure that we leave you with tangible tools. I want this webinar to be meaningful for those who've participated and those who have given our time. So just in recap, if there were 3 takeaways that I would want a nonprofit leader to walk away from this webinar with is, number 1, particularly when we're talking about better meetings, better virtual meetings, and decision-making, think through and be intentional about your agenda. The more time you can spend in thinking through the agenda and preparing a thoughtful agenda, that's the first step to success. Step 2, test, test, test. Even when we think every member of the team is ready for a Zoom meeting, don't just assume that everybody is as familiar with Zoom or the virtual platform as you are. And third is engagement. Build engagement, look at that agenda over and over again, and ask yourself the simple question, am I making sure there are on-ramps for each of my board members to this discussion? Or am I leaving any board members behind through reporting or through committee reports? Where are the on-ramps for engagement, and how are we intentionally planning those?
Well, guys, you are brilliant. Thank you so much. As I mentioned earlier, I am recording this, so I will circulate a recording of the webinar. It will include the slides, and I will be including some of the suggested resources that Greg and Bill brought to our attention. But I want to thank you both again for your time, and thanks to everyone for spending the hour with us. I hope you'll think about attending our last and final webinar of 2020. And I want to wish you all a terrific day.